Welcome to the second episode of Timeline of COVID.
In this episode, we are going to talk about some relatively mild, common neurological symptoms of COVID-19.
COVID-19 related symptoms widely vary among patients, ranging from mild fever to acute delirium. Some people are asymptomatic, meaning that they don't develop symptoms or feel sick at all.
One of the most common and early symptoms of COVID is loss of smell without any nasal obstruction. Unlike other viruses that damage the upper respiratory system that do cause nasal congestion in addition to anosmia, SARS-CoV-2 leaves the nasal pathway unaffected. Although infecting the olfactory neurons seems like the most obvious route to cause smell dysfunction, it's actually the supporting cells that are damaged.
This is why sense of smell returns relatively faster than other types of anosmia caused by viruses that do directly damage the olfactory neurons.
Yes, let's talk about the underlying mechanism behind this indirect neuron infection of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. In order for the virus to enter our body, it needs to bind to an angiotensin-converting enzyme 2 receptor protein, or AC2 receptor protein, on the host cell's membrane. However, regulatory genes in the olfactory sensory neurons inhibits the expression of the AC2 coding gene. Since the membrane lacks the receptor cells required for viral entry, there is no direct route for the virus to enter and infect the neurons.
Now you might be wondering what structures actually do express these ACE2. In the roof of the nasal cavity, there is a specialized tissue called the olfactory epithelium where both ACE2 and TMPRSS2 membrane proteins are expressed. The SARS-CoV-2 virus attaches to and invades host cells using these two membrane proteins.
Inside the nasal cavity, olfactory epithelium expresses olfactory receptors to detect odor in the environment. In addition to the receptors, olfactory sensory neurons and their supporting cells are also a part of the olfactory epithelium. Therefore, infecting the olfactory epithelium would disrupt the odor detection functions, resulting in smell dysfunction. Do you want to explain what the supporting cells do?
Sure. Sustentacular cells are epithelial cells that wrap around sensory neurons for structural and metabolic support. When these sustentacular cells are damaged, they are regenerated from basal cells that also repair the olfactory epithelium. Because these cells are located so closely to olfactory sensory neurons, they can indirectly damage the neurons that detect odor and transmit odor and information to the brain.
It's important to pinpoint the role of basal cells because this explains why anosmia is just temporary. Actually, the olfactory bulb is one of the few sensory organs that can regenerate its cells. This important feature allows the sense of smell to restore itself after a few weeks as sustentacular cells regenerate from basal cells.
Since we now know the basics of the underlying causes of loss of smell, we can delve deeper into this neurological issue in detail. So how exactly does the SARS-CoV-2 virus infect these supporting cells?
Let's take a closer look at the structure of nerve cells. In the olfactory neuron's nucleus, there is a specialized protein network called the olfactosome. The olfactosome enhancer, a non-coding region of the DNA, chooses a single allele for a receptor gene copy among 1,000 different gene sequences located downstream of it. This characteristic shows that gene expression in olfactosome is controlled by specific regulatory genes instead of having polycistronic mRNA like prokaryotes do. Sadly, this mechanism hasn't been fully understood in detail yet.
To detect odor, membrane proteins on an olfactory receptor are activated. Once the odor molecule binds to the receptors, the binding mechanism induces a sequence of transduction signals which tells the brain about the odor detection. It is not the neurons themselves, but the olfactosome that get damaged by the SARS-CoV-2 virus, causing loss of smell.
The difference between patients who reported sensory loss and those who didn't was a difference in the locus of the two olfactory genes, UGT2A1 and UGT2A2. These genes are expressed in the olfactory epithelium to metabolize odorants. The underlying mechanism is still unclear, but the current study posits that the impairment from infected cells may lead to smell loss.
Great. Let's talk about the second symptom of the episode, brain fog. This can develop into an acute state of confusion known as delirium. It is not as common as the loss of smell, but patients recovering from typical respiratory symptoms of COVID-19 experience this lingering brain fog such as short-term memory loss, confusion, and inability to concentrate.
COVID-19 is a relatively new virus that is yet to be fully understood in research. However, preliminary data shows that COVID-19 can invade the brain and cranial nerves to cause neurological symptoms. In other words, the virus is neuroinvasive and thus infects the central nervous system. These symptoms can be as simple as loss of smell or encephalitis that affects the entire immune system.
According to New York Presbyterian and Columbia University Irving Medical Center, the COVID brain fog is due to immune system activation. When the virus invades human cells, the immune system releases inflammatory cytokines in the cerebrospinal fluid surrounding the brain. While fighting off the SARS-CoV-2 virus, these molecules also encourage brain inflammation as a side effect. This inflammation hinders the ability of neurons to communicate with each other, thereby causing the COVID brain fog.
In addition to cytokines, elevated levels of proteins and unexpected antibodies in the cerebrospinal fluid also indicate brain inflammation. Let's talk about some other causes of brain fog. Damaged lungs infected by the SARS-CoV-2 virus can lead to an autoimmune disorder that makes the immune system attack healthy cells and obstruction of small blood vessels in the brain. These conditions reduce oxygen delivery to the brain and ultimately affect some functions carried out by the organ.
This indirect effect of COVID on the nervous system is consistent with the point made earlier in this podcast episode. Keep in mind that it is the surrounding structures of the nervous system that are infected and cause such neurological problems, not the neurons.
COVID brain fog usually goes away in about 3 months, but can last longer. Current research shows a high recovery rate from these symptoms, but it is still possible for the virus to cause persistent effects on the brain due to acute neuroinflammation. To treat brain fog or temporary delirium, we recommend you get plenty of sleep for your brain to repair itself and eat well so the body is nourished. Exercising will also help oxygenate and clear toxins from the body.
Our third topic of this podcast episode is headaches. Patients experience COVID headache as one of the most common early symptoms which can often linger long after recovery, leading to post-COVID migraines. This is probably the most common neurological symptoms caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus and can either be episodic or an all-day headache. Could you tell us how patients get a headache?
Yeah, for sure. There are two popular theories about COVID-induced headaches in the research field, but there's no clear etiology behind the pain. The first theory states that getting a headache is likely a result of systemic inflammation, just like brain fog. Again, proteins called cytokines are released by immune cells in our body and cause inflammation and a fever, which often leads to a headache. Another theory about COVID-induced headache is that the coronavirus might actually enter the fluid around the brain known as the cerebrospinal fluid. However, there is insufficient evidence to support this theory yet.
In most cases, severe headaches only last a few days, while it can last up to months in some people. In our next podcast episode, we'll talk about some acute neurological symptoms caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Thank you for listening.